Quilted Comfort, the quilts and quilting of family and friends of Shara L. and David Palmer. Is there a treasured quilt in your past, present, or future? Layers of fabric melded together by sturdy threads and fine needles to create quilts with patterns known by many names, sewn into rainbows and gardens of color. Americans took this needle art and carried it to new heights, blending their need for economy, utility, and beauty into an art form admired by the world. The quilts and accessories today are not of particular value. Only one of them is to be donated to a public collection here in Connecticut due to its value and age. Almost without fail, the others were created from the 1920s through the 1970s in the Midwest or the South. All are part of my personal collection of textiles and most of the work of older family members or older friends who have passed on. They were entrusted to me along with their patterns, templates, and tools, for they saw me as a younger custodian of the work of their hands. I was honored and am honored still by their trust. I'm now in my 70s and have begun to think of not only my own future, but the future of the creations of the women of my past. Some of these quilts are lovely, some are only beloved. All I willingly share with you, for I am here to tell their story, not my own. Okay, this one. My beloved mother-in-law created many of the quilts that you'll see here, and this one is called Mother's Poppy Quilt. It was the first one of the applique quilts that she did, and she was so pleased with the outcome. And she worked as an emergency nurse during the night for newborn babies, and this is the way she relaxed, was learning to applique. My beloved mother-in-law and friend, Jessie Palmer Sims, created this quilt in all its brilliant color. She made many such preferred applique and often relying on intricate quilt kits with pre-cut pieces to speed the process. She was always rushing through life as an emergency room nurse, and quilting was her peaceful place. Mother created the simple and beautiful, but always looked forward to the day when she would consider herself adept enough to attempt an all-white counterpane. She passed away before that day came, but the sight of these red poppies in my home is a wonderful reminder of her vibrant personality and love for me and mine. And here's the vignette that we have of Mother's things, and she's done other pieces in this exhibit as well. But here she is. She is the shortest little girl in the back. Her mother died just hours after her birth, but she was saved. She was less than a pound, but she was saved by being put in a shoebox in 1908 and put in the lowered door of the wood stove, and they kept her warm until she managed to survive. And she was tough, and she survived until in her 80s. So there's one of her shoes, her sewing scissors. It looked like the bird that I was given, and various things in there all belong to her, and one of her work baskets. Now, this quilt here is the only one that I have that is probably has great value to it, and it's going to go to the Connecticut Historical Society. I took it down there, and they say that it fills a slot in their collection. After the Revolutionary War, but not far into the 19th century, someone living near Salem, Connecticut, was stitching fabric together to create this old quilt. It's composed of hand-blocked red prints and early roller prints of a lion, chariot, and famous founders. The backing was woven on an early loom, taking more time than you or I would ever want to contemplate. I was a lucky person to find this piece of New England history for $105 in a small collectibles shop in Salem. The Historical Society has asked that it be donated to fill a gap in their collection of quilts, and would be the only one of my quilts to be so honored. This is the backing no matter what color the backing is, it's called yellow. So it looks beige, but history calls it yellow, and so does the museum. Oh, Grandma Bryn's quilt will come around and get that at the end. Stars within stars. This quilt cost me only a couple of $100, yet I paid what was asked. How so? Years ago, while attending a rummage sale and bake sale to benefit a church in West Hartford, I spied this large orange and white quilt with matching crocheted pillow slips. It was to be sold to the highest silent bidder. I, who could not win a door prize if only one other person was present, decided to make a reasonable bid, high enough to not be insulting, yet low enough to suit my pocketbook. At the end of the day, a phone call came to me that it was mine. I was thrilled. In my mind, I had already placed it on my four-poster bed with white linen dust ruffle and feather pillows tucked into the slips. I sped to the scene expecting smiles, congratulations from all corners of the room, and a thank you very much, to which I intended to express my pleasure at being the lucky recipient of such a lovely work of art. Instead, I was handed this lovely without a word or a smile, except for a nearby spectator in the church who said, "She sure got that for nothing." Did it spoil my pleasure? Dampen my spirits? Maybe just a smidge, possibly a tad. My language is very different from New England language. Okay, you want to stop? Wedding ring with bright orange blocks interspersed with purple lining. My husband slept under this and remembers this quilt from his childhood. It saw rough wear from him and his visiting friends. He was a real boy, unafraid by use of pink or purple in the textiles that always covered every bed in his mother's house. The quilt disappeared when he was about age 14. He remembers its loss only because it accompanied a tragedy in his eyes. One day he returned from school to find that in his absence, his forceful mother had herself sawn the high post ends off of his beloved twin bed. He was tall enough by then that he could rest his feet upon the high wooden spindle design at the foot of the bed. The wooden piece was gone, already discarded in the alley behind the garage, and the sawdust had been cleaned up. The old quilt enjoyed as many of his friends. He'd just disappeared and replaced by a modern bed with a chenille bedspread. Quilters never throw away the work of their hands. Years later, when she left this earth and the work of cleaning out the house began, this old boyhood treasure came to life where she had stashed the too good to use and too tatty to be seen in a deep and dark overhead storage cabinet near the ceiling in her bedroom. Cobweb in white and black. This quilt has seen better days. It first saw the light of day in the hands of either Isidore Sims Yates or her sister, Martha Sims Muskelly, in Nauvoo, Alabama. Both were elderly when I came into the family, but it was a family of many children, so I'm certain that this simple design and practical colors saw much service and deserves and enjoys the title of tattered but proud. Isidore was tall and skinny and olive-skinned with pointed nose and snappy black-brown eyes and hair to match, hair always in a bun. Her words were as sharp as her accent was Southern, and everyone knew where she stood. She took no guff and suffered no fools. Sister Martha was her opposite in every way, beloved by all, soft-spoken, softly rounded, with blue eyes, blonde, white hair, and fair skin. You could imagine that she was everyone's best friend and never uttered a harsh word to anyone. They were inseparable, a team, one tiny house, one unbreakable bond. The Sister Sims quilts. Every time I see these quilts, I think once again of distant relatives, sisters born in the twilight years of the 19th century. living out their long and fruitful years in a tiny log house in rural Alabama. Visit South always included a sermon by the circuit preacher in the tiny country church, with shaped note singing, raising the rafters with joyful sound, and every dawn beginning with the smell of hot biscuits wafting from the kitchen as men folks and guests sat in rocking chairs on the front porch till called to eat. Martha and Isidore Sims worked hard, raised children, but always saved time to sit, visit, take snuff, and create quilts. Often more utilitarian than beautiful. Many patterns, the bow tie, the spider web, that used every scrap, all passed through their hands. They mended the worn, accepted the cast-off clothing of neighbors for piecing scraps, and stitched their plain-spoken, sincere way of life into every quilt. Their like will be not seen again.
This is the
Mr. Palmer, where should have made you?
6-point stars with beige background. I know this was a family quilt. I believe that it was the work of Maudie Armstrong Lehman because of the exceptional stitching and coloration. She was a perfectionist. I do know that it graced our own bed for many years and that its coloration was perfect for all the surroundings in the many homes we had over the years of our marriage, 56 years.
most welcome. And this chair you can sit in the
Sorry, I have thyroid disease, so I shake every time.
You better, okay.
Make them all?
Thank you anyway.
The quilt of pink painted roses. Grandma Nettie Burkett of Christopher, Illinois, painted this quilt at a very advanced age. Her daughter Ermelie, friend to my mother, saw the need to keep Grandma occupied. Nettie's many talents for fashioning and embroidering the clothing of her 2 children many years before were long lost in her memories. Her daughter, ever devoted, purchased one of the new paint markers and put Nettie to work. I believe this was her final endeavor, and I was entrusted with keeping it safe and have done so proudly.
She has a couple of 3.
Where is
These are some of the tools that I have inherited from others, or that a couple of them that I have purchased. There are the stencils that they used on the quilts, an early pair of gold glasses, someone local that had passed and they were selling at a tag sale her scissors. I thought that they needed to be saved and presented somewhere so she would be remembered. I have a shaker pincushion, pieces of sterling silver for measures, something to cut and make perforations in the paper so that you could make your quilt blocks, emery-filled pin cushions, and a cushion down here that is rather modern, but the exciting thing about it is 18th century French fabric on the flower. Pinwheel with diamonds and double wedding ring. I kept promising myself I'm going to start over. I keep promising myself to put a tiny, particularly stitched tag on each of these quilts, made in China. You see, I am ambivalent about their loveliness, enjoying their use while promising unspoken to make certain that any future owner beyond my years will not mistake them for American antiques quilts brought across Appalachian prairies and mountains, or a young bride, or pieced at a quilting in Appalachia. Yet like every person or object, they too have a story to tell. My husband travels to a few foreign places in the world and have not yet been my pleasure to see. Yet when he finally unpacks his luggage in our Farmington home once again, he always has brought me a memento, a gift, a recalling so that I can share his adventures. Here is their story and his. The Great Wall of China outside Beijing was often a series of steep steps with landings and lookouts abounding. The common people were allowed to sell their produce and crafts from their assigned place on the wall. In the case of quilts, the ladies dressed in traditional clothing, mandarin collar, tunic, and pants, chose to display their wares by hanging them unfurled over the side of the wall. What a sight that must have been, a piece of home so far from home for his eyes. Do not think that it sits easy on me, that these quilts were handmade by row upon row of women and girls. Some were cutting, some piecing, some pressing, others quilting. Yet I have lived and traveled much in countries of the world where there is no dishonor or feeling of being exploited when doing an honest job at a local rate of pay. Actually, this work is well appreciated and often sought. Sweatshop is an American word, not a Chinese one or an Indian or Pakistani or Egyptian or Filipino one. I chose to think of the beauty of their colors, the distance they have traveled to find me, the love of the man who gifted them to me. Do I think they were too much of a bargain at $55? Yes. And even though I will have them always, I do think I'll add the little tag with the disclaimer, made in China in 1995.
Excuse me.
Pastel stars with pale pink backing. This quilt is a favorite of mine. Maudie Armstrong Lehman, its maker, had a wonderful color sense, much more soothing than Grandma Brim's work or the work of my darling Jessie. Her colors did not jump, they walked softly. She had no children, and therefore time was hers to spend as she chose. She chose to spend it creating beauties like this. I have told you that she was a watcher. She had at the State Insane Asylum at Anna, Illinois, and this quilt must have taken extra time and planning, many stitches, subtle colors. It is a field of calm when placed across a queen-size bed. Aunt Maudie's Flower Basket Quilt. My husband David's Aunt Maudie created this quilt and many others during the years she spent as a midnight to dawn watcher at what was commonly called an insane asylum years ago. The needlework you see in light shades of green with flowers and soft colors is the most lively of all that she stitched. Most were somber and dark-hued, as were her surroundings and her human charges all those years ago. Jessie's Star Flower Picot Quilt. My husband's mother, Jessie Palmer Sims, created this lovely, brilliant sea of color as a gift for us. We treasure it as a work of her art, and for all the hundreds of hours her fingers and tiny tween needles and delicate stork-shaped sewing scissors labored over it. Strangely, the thing she valued most about it and consumed the most of her time, that she would always say, "Did you see those picot points I made for the edge?" Everything else was forgotten. That was hard, she said.
Well, thank you. Wow. Anybody who'd like to see the historic house, I'm going to start a tour shortly.
This is one of the exhibit cases that has many of the things I have either found or have been given to me by family friends through the years, and I am their caretaker. I'm getting old now, but I wanted to be able to show them the work of people's hands and what they used to get that work done. So here are some of the places that they stuck those pins and those needles, and little cases that held the needles, and a bit of the old pins still in their case. Things made of silk and things made of hand-woven details, things made of 19th century tapestry, the blankets that they used then and they called summer-winter quilts, and many things. This my husband got me in celebration of the bicentennial, and my husband would be the one to think of things like this, where they did the stamp of a quilt and then a quilt block, and he surprised me with that. The Octagon Star. Pale yellow print, faded blue and white, simplistic coloration, not easy to piece. Top stitches that seem to vary in skill from place to place, as though sewn by more than one. Faded glory, I called it, yet I know that it was my husband's Aunt Maudie who did all the work in the 1930s. She was a watcher, and I tell her story before, and mostly she sat in a chair in the hallway in the hospital, listening for distress and watching for trouble that sometimes came. I'm certain that this quilt began life with vivid color. Aunt would use no remade used fabrics that had seen better days, as an old shirt, a dress, or an apron. With no children and a husband who brought home his pay, she was allowed certain privileges of buying yard goods that her sister Jessie, my beloved mother-in-law, did not have. The unevenness of the stitches in comparison to the precision of the piecing makes me wonder if there were nights of ease producing fine work, nights of stress bringing carelessness. I only know that when Aunt Marty died an untimely death, her sister Jessie was made to purchase, not received by gift, every piece her sister's hands had ever wrought. Jessie cared for these quilts as if they were made of gold, not to be washed, just air-dried. Why then, years later, at her own death, was only this one quilt found faded with washing and laid sandwiched between her mattress and the steel bed springs as if a dust protector? There's a story here, dearest Jessie. Whisper and tell me what it is. The bow tie with bright pink backing. This quilt shows the work of two families of women. Often the Illinois Yankees would piece a top during the winter, yet put off the quilting. They knew that the sisters Sims in a small house in Nauvoo, Alabama, would take much time and small stitches for small change and do the finishing. If a trip south by auto was not planned, the post office on each end of the journey was entrusted with the quilt. I do remember one comment my mother-in-law Jessie when this quilt arrived back home in Illinois. She said, "Isidore and Martha must be getting too old since these stitches are not good." When I get a little money, I buy books. If any is left, I buy food and clothing. That's my motto. These are my personal books that are from my home library, but I've hoped during this session that people will come in and read and sit in the rocking chair and enjoy themselves. These slim offerings in this corner are my own contributions to the world of quilting. Of all the things in the room, they are the least valuable and probably the least well done, but I worked hard on them, learning to do it, and wish that I was a help that I could continue. But that's behind me now. Here, and I don't really have a family story about it, but I have this quilt. I know it was in the family. I don't know the details of it, but I found out from a staff member here at the StanleyWhitman Museum that this quilt names and pattern, it was called the Glorified Nine Patch, and that's the extent of what we know. This is an example of the quilting fabrics that I have acquired that I have not used as of yet, but that I still have hopes of doing something very plain and simple, along with a basket filled with all of the patterns that the women in this room have left me. And I could not throw them away, even though they go from 1910 to the present time. So they're all here, and someday I hope I find someone that's interested in them that I can pass them along to that could make use. I acquire quilt patterns in glass. I acquired this one at a sale where someone had cut it up and framed it, and I bought it and brought it home with me. There were several others in the room as well. And I often went to tag sales, and I would find that someone had started a quilt, never finished it, like Sunbonnet Sue and others. That's gotten this. Tree of Life, question mark. This applique quilt was created by Jessie Myrtle Sims. It is her usual perfect work. I'm uncertain of the pattern name. She just called it the Tree of Life. That's good enough for me. There can be any doubt that this quilt kit of the 60s, it screams it in print selection and color. The words "Creations by Busilla" could probably be found under the lining, yet it's beautifully appliqued with tiny stitches hidden ever so nicely. I remember when this particular quilt entered through the back door of my beloved mother-in-law Jessie's house. It was enveloped in a large garbage bag, packed tight with sheet backing, pre-stamped top, fiber fill, and what looked like to my 20-year-old eyes, thousands of scraps of colored fabric that someone would have to make into flowers and leaves. It was a discard gained at cents on the dollar from near neighbors, maiden sisters who purchased new and never finished their projects. A 1960 spring followed by summer and fall, she spent in a green rocker on a screened-in porch in the heartland, stitching hour after hour. A tiny, curly-haired grandson sat watching her move each stitch that she took. That's why at her death, years later, this quilt, of all the beauties that she possessed, was chosen by that little boy, now a man, to be his own. It is more precious than rubies. 9-patch. This brilliant 9-patch is a favorite of mine, rather small, with 63 patches of vivid color. All of you quilters know that this is the simplest form a quilt can take, yet these 9 patches seem to leap off of the white ground with its tiny, even stitches, carefully drawn pencil lines still visible around the templates of cardboard and sandpaper that many will recognize from peeking into Grandma's sewing box years ago. This is a Pennsylvania quilt, found at a large flea market. The maker's name is lost to us, yet I like to imagine that during a cold, wet, and foggy winter's day, a gray-haired lady of a certain age felt the need for sunshine and blue skies, so she picked up her needle and created this top, bit of brightness in short order, but labored long to carefully draw the template lines and quilt them finely. At last a frame was needed to hold all the sunshine and sky she had read, so she bound the edges to hold it all inside. This quilt was unused when purchased, ergo my imagination tells me she is older rather than young, for a young woman would never have let it go for the pittance I paid. She is most probably no longer among the living as well, for that if that were not so, it would have remained where it had lain, inside a cedar chest of early marriage, wrapped in clean white cotton. Bless you, whoever you are. The work of your hands is loved again. Filled with things that really in today's world would not be considered beautiful. But I put a sign on it that says, surely beauty is more than skin deep. And I mean that. There are early toiles here that are from the late 18th century, early 19th century. There are patterns that are very intricate and hard to do. A piece of a quilt that had been torn apart, which I would never do, but someone had done it in my place. And piece that I found in Texas of the basket of flowers. Memories of my great-grandmother, Mary Larkin Hall Brim. She died in 1962, a woman of great courage. She was less than 5 foot tall. When I first knew her, she had a long braid down her back. She walked with crutches for almost all of her life from a childhood disease. And she quilted for herself, and she quilted for other people. This is her only quilt book, and I inherited because I was the oldest grandchild, and a small booklet that has how to make crepe paper flowers, because what she did to earn extra money was to make crepe paper flowers for other people in the community to put on the graves of the family and to have in their homes as a bouquet. So she had a valuable, very wonderful, long life. Grandma Brim's Texas Star Quilt. This brand quilt of many colors was the last that my great-grandmother made before her death in 1962, only hours after the birth of our son, making 5 generations, however brief. Both her poverty and attitude of make do or do without led her to make use of fabrics given to her in exchange for sale of her chicken spreads, laid eggs, or for piecing a top for a neighbor, or for making of her famous crepe paper flowers, which townspeople used to decorate the grave of their loved ones. Mary Brim was part Cherokee Indian and proud of it. She raised and nurtured 14 children, some sets of twins, many that lived and some that did not, in a tiny 3-room house not too far from the Trail of Tears that an ancestor must have forced march earlier in the 19th century. As her eldest great-grandchild, this quilt as a top came to my hands. My husband's mother, Jessie,
used it as the vehicle to teach me, her much less talented daughter-in-law, to stitch it into the quilt you see here today.